The day Elara Voss shot the hat clean off Deputy Hicks's head from 200 yards was the day the town of Raydrock Crossing decided, once and for all, that she was simply too much woman for any man in the Arizona Territory. It was the summer of 1882, and the desert heat lay across the land like a brand pressed slow and deliberate into hide, shimmering up from the red clay roads in waves that made distant mountains look like they were breathing. Raydrock Crossing sat at the base of those mountains, a scattering of timber frame buildings and adobe walls that passed for civilization in a stretch of country where civilization was still largely theoretical. There was a general store, a livery, a saloon that doubled as a courthouse on the 2 occasions a year when a circuit judge bothered to ride through, a church whose congregation dwindled every Sunday in direct proportion to the heat outside, and a post office that also served as the territorial land office, which was the source of most of the trouble. Elara had not meant to shoot the deputy's hat off. She had meant to shoot the hat off the man standing beside the deputy, a land agent named Cornelius Pratt, who had arrived 6 weeks prior from Tucson, with a leather satchel full of papers that he claimed gave him legal authority over the water rights to Broken Creek. Broken Creek was the only reliable water source within 12 miles in any direction, and it ran directly through the eastern pasture of the Voss family ranch, which Elara had been running alone since her father died of a chest illness the previous November, and her 2 older brothers had packed themselves off to California chasing silver rumors neither of them had the sense to question. She had aimed true. But Cornelius Pratt had stepped sideways at exactly the wrong moment to accept a pouch of tobacco from the deputy, and so it was Deputy Hicks who lost his hat in a spray of felt and dust, staggering backward into the water trough with a splash that soaked him to the collar. Elara lowered her Winchester, looked at the scene with calm brown eyes that held not a flicker of apology, and said, very clearly, that she would not be signing any papers that gave a stranger from Tucson rights to water that had fed her family's cattle for 18 years. The town watched from the boardwalk. Nobody said a word for a long moment. Then old Mabel Greer, who ran the millinery and had opinions about everything, shook her head slowly and murmured to the woman beside her that it was a genuine tragedy what had become of that Voss girl. Too fierce by half, she said. Too fierce for any man to manage. And what would become of her, running that ranch alone, fighting land agents alone, shooting at officials of the territorial government alone? She would end up alone, that was what, because no decent man was going to hitch himself to that particular fire. Elara heard it. She had ears like a hawk, and the wind was coming from the right direction. She heard every word, and she turned her gaze toward Mabel Greer with an expression that made the older woman take a very small step backward behind her bolt of calico. Then Elara mounted her roan mare, tucked the Winchester back into its scabbard, and rode home. She did not cry until she was past the ridge and out of sight of the town. And even then, it was not a long cry. It was the kind of cry you allow yourself when you are very tired and very alone, and the weight of a thing you did not choose presses down on you just for a moment before you straighten your spine and keep going. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist, set her jaw, and put her eyes on the road that wound down toward the creek valley where her ranch waited for her, with its chores and its needs and its stubborn persistence, much like herself. The Voss ranch was not grand. It had never been grand. Her father Jacob had built the main house with his own hands, and the help of 2 Tohono O'odham men from the village south of the creek, who had worked with him in exchange for fair wages at a time when fair wages from a white rancher were not guaranteed. The house was solid adobe with thick walls that kept out the worst of the heat, a covered porch that ran the full length of the front, and a kitchen garden that Elara tended with the same focused intensity she brought to everything. She had 23 head of cattle, 4 horses, a pig of uncertain temperament, and a dog named Sergeant who had 1 gray ear and a philosophical outlook on life. She had 1,400 acres of territorial land deed that was entirely, legally hers. She had the water rights to Broken Creek documented in her father's hand in a ledger that sat in a strongbox beneath her bed. And she had a land agent named Cornelius Pratt who had produced documents from Tucson that contradicted every word of that ledger, and a circuit judge who would not arrive until October. The problem had been growing for weeks, and Elara had been fighting it the only way she knew how, which was to show up, stand firm, and refuse to yield an inch. But showing up and standing firm cost something. It cost sleep, and it cost the hours she should have been spending on ranch work, and it cost her the goodwill of the town because nobody in Red Rock Crossing much liked conflict, even when the conflict was justified, and they had a talent for blaming the person making the noise rather than the person causing the problem. She was unsaddling the mare in the barn when she heard the sound of hoofbeats on the road from the north, which was unusual enough to make her pause. The road from the north came down through the pass from Flagstaff, and travelers on it were rare. She came out of the barn with her hand resting easy on the grip of the revolver at her hip, because easy was not naive, and naive got people killed. The rider came around the bend at a steady trot, not rushing, not skulking, the kind of pace that suggested a man who knew exactly where he was going, and was not in a particular hurry because he trusted himself to get there. He was riding a dark bay horse that moved with the good, easy stride of an animal well cared for and sensibly worked. The man himself was lean and long in the saddle, wearing a canvas duster that had seen considerable weather, and a hat so sun-faded it had ceased to have a definitive color. He had a bedroll tied to the back of his saddle, a rifle in the scabbard, and the settled, watchful quality of a person who had spent most of his life outdoors. He pulled up when he saw her at the edge of the barnyard, and he touched the brim of his colorless hat in greeting. "Afternoon," he said. "I'm looking for the Voss Ranch. A fellow in town said I might find work here." His voice was unhurried and direct, with a slight roughness to it like the grain on good timber. He looked to be somewhere in his late 20s, maybe 28 or 29, with a face that the sun had worked over honestly, brown from the jaw to the forehead, with the kind of lines at the corners of his eyes that came from squinting into distance rather than from worry. Elara did not move her hand from her revolver. "What fellow in town?" "Big man at the livery, red beard. Said the Voss Ranch was short on hands and the owner might be hiring." That would be Pete Callahan, who ran the livery and was, in his way, something of a one-man employment agency for the region, matching drifting cowboys to ranches that needed them. Pete was generally reliable. Generally. "What is your name?" she asked. "Cole Whitaker," he said. He said it without hesitation and without embellishment, which she noted. "You have experience with cattle." "I have experience with most things that involve the back end of a cow," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in something that was almost a smile but held enough self-restraint to be something more interesting than easy charm. "I worked 6 years on the tanner spread up near Flagstaff before it sold. Before that, I was with a trail crew out of Texas. I can mend fence, shoe a horse, pull a calf, and I cook well enough to keep a man alive, which is about all that can be said for trail cooking." "Can you manage yourself around a woman who runs her own operation?" Elara asked. She said it flat and direct, with no apology for the directness, watching his face for the thing that usually came next, which was a certain flicker, a flinch of male pride, or the particular smile that men wore when they were about to suggest that running her own operation was adorable. Cole Whitaker looked at her without the flinch and without that smile. He tilted his head slightly, as though considering the question with genuine interest rather than the offense he could have taken. "I expect so," he said. "As long as you can manage yourself around a man who has opinions about fence line and will say them plainly when he has them." It was not the answer she had expected. She stood with it for a moment, turning it over. "Wages are $30 a month, meals included," she said. "You bunk in the barn until I decide whether you are worth the trouble of finishing the hand's cabin. You work from sunup and you stop when the work is done, which usually means after sundown. You have a problem with any of that. There is a road in both directions. 30 is fair, Cole said. I appreciate the honesty about the cabin situation. I appreciate that you did not tell me you appreciate my frankness, Elara said. Most men follow that statement up by telling me they appreciate my frankness in a tone that means they think I am a curiosity. Cole dismounted. He was taller than she had estimated from the saddle, with the comfortable ease of movement of someone who carried himself without thinking about it. He led his horse to the fence and tied him with the kind of knot that indicated he had been tying horses in working situations for a long time. I did not come here to tell you what you are, he said, turning to face her. I came here looking for work. Elara studied him for another long moment. Sergeant came around from behind the house, assessed the situation, determined that the newcomer did not smell like a threat, and sat down next to the stranger's boots in a gesture of immediate and slightly embarrassing enthusiasm. Traitor, Elara said to the dog. Cole looked down at Sergeant, then back up at her. That almost smile appeared again. I will take that as a good sign, he said. He settled in without fanfare, which was the first thing that surprised her. She had hired 2 hands before, in the years since her father's health had begun to decline, and both of them had required a period of adjustment that involved proving to them, in various ways, that she was genuinely the one in charge, that her instructions were not suggestions, and that her knowledge of the land and the cattle and the operation was not secondary to theirs simply because she had not been born male. One of them had quit within a month. The other had lasted a season and had been perfectly adequate as long as she gave him the illusion that his ideas were being considered, which was exhausting. Cole Whitaker did not require any of that. On the first morning, she showed him the fence lines that needed mending on the north pasture, explained that the eastern corner had been a problem since a late winter flood had undermined the post supports, and said that she wanted it reinforced before she moved the cattle back to that section. He listened, asked 2 practical questions about the soil condition at the corner and what materials she had available, and then went and did it. When she rode out in the afternoon to check, the work was solid and had been done with the kind of attention to detail that indicated he understood that fences were not decorative. Good, she said, looking it over. The soil is softer than it looks in this stretch, he said, standing beside his horse with his hat pushed back slightly. I went deeper on the corner posts and used what flat rock I found to pack around the bases. Should hold better now. That is what I would have done, she said. I figured, he said. You did it on the section to the west already. I could see the rock work. She glanced at him. He was looking at the fence, not at her. There was no performance in it. He had simply noticed. The way a person notices things when they are paying genuine attention to the work rather than to what they look like doing it. She did not say anything else. She rode back toward the house. But something had shifted, slightly and without announcement, like a stone settling into a new position in a creek bed. The trouble with Cornelius Pratt did not go away. 3 days after Cole arrived, Pratt came out to the ranch himself with the deputy and a man from Tucson who introduced himself as a solicitor and who had the soft hands and careful speech of someone who worked entirely indoors. They came in a buggy, which was already a mistake in terms of making an impression on the Voss Ranch Road, which was deeply rutted and did not care about buggy springs. Elara met them in the yard. Cole was working at the far end of the barn, and she was aware of him pausing in his work without quite stopping it, which meant he was there if she needed him and staying back because she had not indicated she needed him. She appreciated the calibration. Pratt was a round-faced man in his 40s with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to having institutional authority smooth the way ahead of him. He got down from the buggy, adjusted his coat, and handed her a folded set of papers. Miss Voss, he said, these are the official findings from the Territorial Land Office in Tucson. The water rights to Broken Creek were registered under the name Harlan Pratt in 1874 by the original survey company. Harlan Pratt is my uncle, and upon his death last year, those rights passed to me as his sole heir. Your father's ledger, whatever it contains, represents a private claim that was never registered with the territory. Elara took the papers. She did not unfold them immediately. She looked at Pratt with the clear, measuring gaze that she used for problems of all varieties. My father's ledger and the claim registered with the territory are different things, she said. The territory's water rights registry was not established in this district until 1877. When it was established, existing claims were to be registered within 90 days. My father registered his claim in the 63rd day. The Harlan Pratt registration, if you look at the date on your documents, is from 1874, before the registry existed, and there is no re-registration from 1877 in this district under any name Pratt. She had spent 3 evenings in the past week going through every piece of paper in the strongbox and cross-referencing it with the copy of the Water Rights Registry that she had written down by hand during a visit to the post office 3 years ago when the postmaster, a meticulous man named Aldous Webb, had let her read through the district record book. She had kept that copy because she had the kind of instinct that told her it would matter someday. The solicitor blinked. He had not expected that. Pratt's confidence flickered just for a moment before it restabilized. Those documents were properly filed with the territorial government, he said. The circuit judge will determine that, Elara said. Until October, I will be continuing to use my water rights, which I have used legally and continuously for 18 years. If you attempt to physically restrict my access to the creek in that time, I will file a complaint for interference with established use. I know the relevant sections of the territorial code. Would you like me to recite them? The solicitor put his hand on Pratt's arm. He leaned in and said something quiet. Pratt looked at Elara with an expression that had gone from confident to something sour and calculating. You are making this more difficult than it needs to be, Pratt said. You came to take my water, Elara said. I am making it exactly as difficult as it deserves to be. Pratt and his companions got back in the buggy. The deputy had not said a word throughout the exchange, possibly because the sound of a rifle had a lasting effect on a man's willingness to volunteer for confrontations. They drove back out the road, the buggy bouncing aggressively over the ruts, and Elara watched them go. She heard Cole walk up behind her, not rushing, stopping at a respectful distance. That was thoroughly done, he said. She turned. He was holding a water ladle in one hand, which meant he had stopped his work to come and be present, and the water ladle was the thing he had grabbed, probably from the barn water bucket, as a reason for walking in this direction that did not look like he was coming to her defense. She noticed that. She noticed the water ladle very specifically, because it was a small thing and small things were how you understood people. Have some water, she said, taking the ladle from him and drinking from it herself, and the corner of his mouth moved with that almost smile, and she turned away before it could do more than it had already done. The evening settled into a pattern that had not been planned by either of them. After supper, which Elara cooked at the kitchen table with the door open to the evening air, Cole would sit on the porch steps with a cup of coffee while she washed the dishes, and sometimes she would come out with her own cup, and they would sit in the blue dark of a desert evening watching the stars come out and talking about practical things. The state of the north pasture, whether it was worth hauling the broken plow frame to the blacksmith in town or trying to mend it at the ranch, the condition of the 3 heifers that were due to calve in the autumn. It was the kind of talk that has warmth in it not because of what is said but because of the ease of it, because 2 people are willing to sit together in the quiet and speak plainly without performance or pretense. One evening, about 3 weeks into his time at the ranch, the conversation turned sideways from practical into something else. It happened because of a letter. Elara had ridden into town that afternoon and come back with the post, and one of the letters was from her brother Marcus in California, and reading it had put a mood on her that the evening chores had not entirely displaced. Marcus wrote that he was doing well and that he hoped she had found someone to help at the ranch because she really ought not to be carrying all of it alone, which was the kind of thing that was technically kind, but managed to suggest that the problem with carrying it alone was her choice rather than his departure. Her other brother, Thomas, had not written in 2 months. Brothers? Cole asked. He had not read the letter, but he had a gift for reading weather. In California, she said. Both of them. Went looking for silver. Did they find any? Marcus found a woman he wanted to marry and a job in a stable. Thomas found a series of saloons, from what I can tell by the infrequency of his letters. Cole was quiet for a moment, looking out at the darkening desert. That must have been a hard choice, he said, when they left. It was their choice to make, Elara said. I am not saying they had no right to go. Father was sick for a long time and they carried that alongside me. When he went, they needed to go somewhere that was not here, and I understand that. What I am less understanding about is the assumption that I would keep carrying the thing they put down. But you are doing it, Cole said. You are still carrying it. Someone has to, she said. This land is ours. It was my grandfather's before my father, and it will be mine, and no land agent from Tucson is going to sit across my yard and tell me differently. She said it with the force of something that had been building for a long time, and when it came out, she was aware of how much heat was behind it, how much was more than just the ranch, how much was the weight of being the one who stayed, and the one who fought, and the one who was called too fierce for her trouble. In my experience, Cole said, slowly and without any lecture in it, the people who have to fight the hardest for a thing are usually the ones who understand it best. Elara looked at him. He was looking at the stars. His profile in the evening light was quiet and direct, and she thought suddenly that he was not a man who said things to fill silence. He said things when he had something to say. What made you leave Flagstaff? She asked. The tanner spread sold to a land company from back east, he said. They brought their own men with them. There was no room for someone who knew the land the way it actually is rather than the way it looks on a map. And before that, Texas. I was 19 when I signed on with that trail crew, he said. I had been working since I was 15. My father had a small farm in East Texas that the drought took. He died the year I left. My mother had already died when I was 12. He said it plainly as information, not as a bid for sympathy, which made it more rather than less affecting. The trail crew was the beginning of learning what I was good at. It turned out I was good at the kind of work that requires patience and physical sense. Not everyone is. I think you have to be built a certain way. What kind of way? She asked, genuinely. The kind where you find the work satisfying in itself, he said, rather than as a means to something else, where the land is interesting to you, where you can spend a day fixing fence and feel at the end of it that you have done something real. Elara was quiet. Then she said, people tell me I work like a man. They mean it as a compliment, but it is always phrased as though my ability to do real work is a deviation from what I ought to be. People tell all kinds of things that say more about them than about the person they are talking to, Cole said. Mabel Greer says I am too fierce for any man, Elara said. She said it lightly, or tried to, but the light did not quite reach it. Cole turned his head and looked at her directly. In the dim evening light, his eyes were dark and steady. Good, he said. So am I. She stared at him. He held her gaze without flinching, without any of the self-congratulatory quality that might have ruined it. And then he looked back at the stars, and the evening went on around them like nothing particular had happened, except that something had, and they both knew it. She lay awake that night for a long time, listening to the desert quiet, thinking about those 4 words and the way they had settled into her like the flat rocks Cole had packed around the fence posts, solid and load-bearing and unexpectedly right in the place where they had been placed. Good. So am I. She had been told her whole life that her fierceness was the problem, the thing to be managed or softened or apologized for. Her mother had said it gently, that she needed to learn to be quieter, lighter, easier in the hand. The suitors who had come by over the years, and there had been a few, had wanted her to be less, to take up less space, to let them lead through territory she understood better than they did. There had been one man, 3 years before, Daniel Reese, a rancher from the Southern District who was handsome and decent, and had been serious enough about her that the conversation had turned toward marriage. And she had liked him well enough right up until the morning he had told her, over coffee, that once they were married she would not need to do all the outdoor work anymore, that he had hands for that, as though the outdoor work were a burden she was enduring rather than a fundamental piece of what she was. She had not been unkind to Daniel Reese. She had simply told him, as clearly as she could, that the woman he wanted to marry and the woman she was were not the same woman. He had ridden away looking baffled, and the town had decided once again that the Voss girl was too much trouble. Cole Whitaker had not told her she was too much trouble. He had said good. She turned over in the darkness, pulled the sheet up despite the heat, and listened to Sergeant shift and settle on the floor by the door, and she made herself think about the fence line in the south pasture rather than the steady, unhurried way that Cole said everything, and eventually she slept. The weeks moved forward the way the territory moved forward, slowly but with direction. The calves came, 3 of them healthy and one that needed pulling and required both her and Cole working through the night in the lantern-lit barn, their hands and forearms covered to the elbow in effort and determination, the exhausted heifer doing her work and the 2 of them doing theirs. When it was over and the calf was on its feet with its strange, wobbling confidence, they both sat back in the straw against the barn wall with the spent relief of a shared difficulty successfully navigated. "You have done this before," he said, more observation than question. 12 years, she said. "My father showed me when I was 15 and then stepped back." He said a body that knows what it is doing should not be supervised by one that does not. "He sounds like a man who knew what things were worth," Cole said. "He did," she said. And then quietly, "I miss him every day. Not in a way that prevents anything, just as a fact." Cole nodded. "That is the right way to miss someone," he said. In the morning, still tired but clean and fed, they sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and Elara looked at Cole across the table and thought that there was something very particular about sitting across from a person with whom you had worked through a difficult night, something that created a familiarity that took most people months or years to achieve through other means. She thought about this very briefly, and then thought about the south fence again, and stood up to start the morning chores. The trouble with Pratt escalated in August, which was perhaps not surprising because the heat of August did something to the patience of men who were not used to the desert's indifference. Pratt began fencing the creek access from the east, on the far side of the water where his land began, which was technically legal but in practical terms threatened to make the creek unusable by a downstream approach. Elara responded by filing a formal complaint with the Territorial Post Office Land Registry, which was the only governmental mechanism available to her at the moment, and by writing a letter to the circuit judge that was detailed, organized, and devastating in its legal clarity. She had Pete Callahan witness her signature on the letter, and Pete, who was not a complicated man but was a fair one, told her in his slow and sincere way that he thought she had the right of it, and he was sorry the town had not been more forthcoming with its support. "Some folks are afraid of Pratt's money," Pete said. "Some folks are always afraid of money," Elara said. "That is what makes people with money so comfortable with using it to fright." She rode back to the ranch. Cole was up on the barn roof repairing a section of shingles that had lifted in the last wind, and he called down to her from up there as she rode in, asking how it had gone, and she told him plainly, and he listened from the roof, and said he thought her letter would do the work it needed to do, and she thought he was probably right. The shift between them happened in increments so small that each one was deniable on its own and meaningful only in accumulation. The evening conversations on the porch growing longer. The moments in the barn or the pasture where the space between them closed naturally in the course of work, and neither of them manufactured a reason to widen it again. The way he had begun to learn the particular rhythm of her thoughts, so that when she was working something through, he did not interrupt or suggest, but simply stayed present until she had arrived wherever she was going. She caught herself one afternoon, watching him from the kitchen window as he led a limping horse in from the pasture, with a gentleness that he did not perform but simply had, and she felt something move in her chest like water shifting direction, like a creek, finding a new channel after a change in the terrain. She stepped back from the window and was very brisk with herself for several hours. It was the third week of August when the thing that changed everything happened, and it did not happen dramatically or with warning. They were in the corral working with the young roan colt that Elara was in the process of gentling, the two of them on either side of the animal, keeping it calm, moving slowly, and Cole said quietly, so as not to startle the horse, that he had been thinking about the cabin. "What about it?" she asked, keeping her eyes on the colt. "I have been thinking that I could finish it," he said. "I have the time in the evenings, and I know what materials we have in the barn. It would not take much, maybe 2 weeks of evenings." "You do not have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I want to." "Why?" she asked, and this was the question she had meant to keep herself from asking, because the asking of it was an acknowledgement that his wanting had become relevant to her. He was quiet for a moment. The colt shifted between them, and they both adjusted without looking away from the horse. "Because I intend to stay," he said. The colt lifted its head. Elara kept her hand steady on its neck. "Stay," she repeated. "If that is agreeable to you," he said. There was something in the careful understatement of it, the way he had built the whole weight of what he meant into 2 words spoken quietly beside a young horse in a corral in the August heat. That was so exactly the language she would have chosen herself that it did something to the architecture of her resolve that she had not been fully prepared for. She kept her eyes on the horse. "It is agreeable to me," she said. He went back to the gentle work with the colt, and so did she, and nothing else was said about it, and everything had changed. He finished the cabin in the evenings over the following 2 weeks, working by lantern light after supper, and she sometimes brought a lamp and sat nearby on a barrel, not to help, which he did not require, but because the companionable presence of the other person had become a natural thing, like weather. She talked while he worked sometimes about the water rights case, about her plans for the ranch in the following year, about the letter she had received from Marcus saying he was getting married to a woman named Clara who was a schoolteacher. "Will you go to California for the wedding?" Cole asked. "I have not decided," she said. "The ranch does not stop needing tending because someone is having a wedding." "I could manage the ranch," he said straightforwardly. She looked at him in the lamplight. "You would do that?" "I just said I would," he said. "You would be here alone for a week or more." "I have been alone for longer stretches than that," he said. "The cattle do not much care whether their keeper has a companion." She was quiet for a moment, sitting with it. "I think I would like to meet Clara," she said finally. "And I should see Marcus. It has been almost 2 years." "Then go," Cole said. "I will keep everything running." She looked at him for a long moment in the lantern light. He was fitting a door frame into the cabin opening, working with steady focus, and his face was lit warm and amber by the lamp, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her in its completeness, that she trusted him. She trusted him the way you trust something that has been tested by time and weight and has proven itself solid, not because you wished it to be, but because it genuinely was. "Cole," she said. He looked up from his work. She did not plan what she said next. It came out of the honest place where things that have been building for weeks finally find the door. "I am not good at this," she said. He waited. "At whatever this is," she said. "I am good at work, and I am good at land law, and I am good at managing difficult situations, and I am not good at the other thing, the softer thing, because I have spent so long being the fierce one that I have not always known what to do with softness." He set down the door frame piece he was holding. He turned fully to face her, and his expression was not the careful diplomatic neutrality of a man managing a situation, but something more honest and more open than that. "Elara," he said. He said her name with a directness that was also a kind of tenderness, 2 things she had not expected to find in the same word. "I am not asking you to be softer. I have never asked you to be anything other than what you are." "I know," she said. That is the problem. He looked at her with eyes that held a warmth she had been watching build for weeks, careful and ungrasping. It is not a problem I am interested in solving, he said. It is the thing I most value about being here. She sat with that on her barrel in the lantern light while the desert night breathed around them, and somewhere far off a coyote said something lonely to the moon. Then she stood up and crossed the short distance between them and kissed him. It was not a tentative kiss. She had not learned tentative. It was a direct and honest kiss, the kind that says I have decided this and I am here, and he received it with the same directness and without any of the performance of surprise that would have cheapened it, his hands coming up to hold her face with a gentleness that had nothing of the diminishing in it. When they stepped back, the desert was still the desert and the lantern was still burning and the door frame was still waiting to be fitted. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. And then, because they were who they were, she went back to her barrel and he went back to the door frame. And the conversation that resumed was about whether the morning would be cool enough to move the cattle to the south water before the day heated up. But the air between them had shifted in the way that only happens when something long building has finally been spoken aloud. And even the practical conversation had a warmth beneath it now that it had not had before. October came, and the circuit judge arrived on a Thursday with a pack mule and a clerk, and the general air of a man who had seen everything twice, and was prepared to be patient with whatever version of frontier dispute he was being asked to resolve this time. Judge Aldous Cartwright was 60 years old and had been riding the territorial circuit for 15 of them, and he had the particular gift of legal fairness that does not require the surroundings to be elegant in order to function. Elara had her strongbox open on the table in the land office by 9 in the morning. Her documents were organized in the order she intended to present them. She had written notes on the relevant sections of Territorial Water Rights Code. She had 3 witnesses: Pete Callahan, who could speak to the public knowledge of her family's water use; old Josiah Harrow, who had worked on the original ranch before her father bought it and had personal memory of the water access; and the postmaster Aldous Webb, who had copies of the registration records from 1877. Cornelius Pratt arrived with his solicitor and a second attorney from Tucson, and a very large folder of documents that were impressively organized, but, as it turned out, could not address the central problem, which was that the Harlan Pratt registration from 1874 was from a survey company that Elara had, through a letter to the county records office in Tucson, established had gone bankrupt and dissolved in 1876. Before the Territorial Water Rights Registry had been established, meaning their original registration carried no legal continuity. Judge Cartwright listened to both sides with the patience of a man who has learned that patience is the most productive luxury available to a person in his position. He asked questions that were precise and showed that he had read the materials before the hearing. He gave Pratt's attorneys a full opportunity to present their counterarguments, and they did so with energy and at length. Then he ruled. He ruled for Voss. He ruled that the Broken Creek water rights, as registered in 1877 under the name Jacob Voss within the 90-day period established by the Territorial Registry, were valid and legally continuous. He ruled that the 1874 Survey Company registration had no standing in the current territorial framework. He issued an injunction against any interference with the Voss Ranch's water access. And he said, in the particular dry tone of a man who has watched a great deal of the frontier's less honorable impulses, that the resources of the territorial court should not be used to dispossess small ranching operations of water rights they have maintained in good faith for nearly 2 decades, and that Mr. Pratt would do well to apply his considerable energy and resources to his legal holdings rather than to other people's water. Pratt's face went through several colors during the reading of this. Then he stood, very stiff, and left with his attorneys without speaking to anyone. Elara sat at the table for a moment after the room had cleared. Webb was gathering his papers. Pete Callahan shook her hand and said he was glad it had worked out, and he had never much liked the look of Pratt anyway. Old Josiah Harrow patted her shoulder with the gnarled hand of a man who had been working this land since before she was born, and said that her father would have been proud, and that was the one that got under her composure just slightly, so that she had to look at the ceiling of the land office for a moment and collect herself. Then she walked outside into the October sun, and Cole was there, leaning against the hitching post outside the building, waiting. She had not asked him to come. He had come anyway without fuss and waited. She walked to him and stopped. He looked at her face and knew. "It worked," he said. "It worked," she said. He pushed off the hitching post and put his arms around her right there on the boardwalk in front of Reedrock Crossing, and she let him, pressing her face briefly against his shoulder, where the canvas of his duster smelled of dust and clean work. And she thought that the quiet of him and the solid warmth of him was the most welcome thing she had felt in a long time. From somewhere behind them she heard Mabel Greer's voice, pitched at the particular frequency it used when observing something it would later report to several people, saying, "Well, would you look at that?" Elara lifted her head from Cole's shoulder and turned to look at Mabel Greer directly, and she smiled, which was perhaps the most surprising thing she had done in public in Reedrock Crossing in years. Mabel Greer blinked. Then, to her credit, she smiled back. The weeks after the ruling had a quality of relief in them, the way the air has, after a long dry spell, finally breaks into rain. The land was still hard and the work was still constant, but the weight of the fight had lifted, and in its absence Elara found she had energy for things she had been too tired to want. She took the trip to California in November, leaving the ranch with Cole, who managed it with exactly the competence she had known he would have, and sent her one letter in the 2 weeks she was gone, which said that all was well, the cattle were healthy, and that Sargent had developed the habit of sitting at the porch steps in the evening staring south in what appeared to be the direction of California with an expression of personal injury. She had laughed at that letter until the laugh turned into something warmer. Marcus was married in a small ceremony in a room above a restaurant, to Clara, who was indeed a schoolteacher, and who had the straight-backed clarity of a person who has spent years maintaining order in a room full of children, and has found it useful in all other situations as well. Elara liked her immediately and completely. Clara was warm and curious and asked direct questions about the ranch and the water rights case and Cole, and when Elara answered, she found herself talking about Cole in a way that made Marcus look at her across the table with the elder brother expression she had not seen since they were children, the one that was partly teasing and partly genuine surprise and partly something softer. "You like him," Marcus said. "Obviously," Elara said. "I mean in the other way," Marcus said. "I know what you mean," Elara said. "Are you going to do something about it?" "I have already done several things about it," Elara said. "Mind your own business and pass the bread." But she rode back to Arizona territory with something warm sitting in her chest that was not just the relief of the water rights or the pleasure of having seen her brother married to a good woman. It was the particular warmth of knowing where you are going and wanting to get there. She arrived at the ranch on a December afternoon, with the air carrying the first cold edge of winter, and the light going amber and low over the red hills. Cole was in the corral with the roan colt, who had progressed considerably, and he saw her coming down the road and put his hand up in greeting without stopping his work, which was exactly right, and she rode into the yard and dismounted, and Sargent came flying from the direction of the barn at a pace that suggested the personal injury had been genuine. She kneeled down for the dog, and then she stood and walked to the corral fence, and Cole brought the colt to a gentle stop and came to where she stood. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Everything is very all right," she said. "Marcus is married and Clara is wonderful and the beef pie in San Francisco is not as good as mine." He smiled. A full smile this time, not the almost version, and she had not seen the full version very often because he used it carefully, which made it worth more. "I missed you," she said. She said it directly because that was the only way she knew to say things. "I missed you," he said just as directly. Winter on the ranch had its own particular character, slower and more inward, the days short and the work condensed into the hours of best light, the evenings long around the lamp with the cold pressing against the thick adobe walls and doing very little harm to the warmth inside. They spent those evenings in ways that had accumulated their own comfortable ritual. She read while he mended tack, or he played quiet tune on the old harmonica he carried in his coat pocket while she wrote letters, or they sat at the table with the account books going over the year's numbers, which were better than they had any right to be, and which she attributed equally to the savings from not losing the water rights and to the quality of Cole's work through the season. One evening in January, with a cold wind finding every gap in the porch boards and the lamp burning bright on the table between them, Cole set down the leather work he had been doing and looked at her in a way that was particular and deliberate. "I would like to say something," he said. "Say it," she said. "I would like to build something here," he said. "Not just work here. I would like to be part of what this ranch is going forward, and I would like to be part of what your life is going forward. If you are willing." She put down her pen. She looked at him across the lamp, at the honest and careful face of him, the man who had packed the fence posts with flat rock and finished the cabin and come to the land hearing and waited on the boardwalk and missed her when she was gone. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she said. "I am," he said. "That was not very romantic," she said. "I can try again," he said, "but I will probably say it approximately the same way." "Good," she said. "Because if you had started rhyming or gone down on one knee, I would have known you were someone else entirely." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, which was warm and rough and still. "Yes," she said. He turned his hand over and held hers. "Good," he said. They were married in March because Elara had no interest in a cold-weather wedding and Cole had no opinion about the month, only the outcome. The ceremony was performed by the pastor at Redrock Crossings Church, a mild and thoughtful man named Reverend Dunes, who had presided over a number of frontier marriages and had learned to keep his sermons practical, and the service itself to a length that did not try the patience of people who had worked since dawn and had work waiting for them the next day. The ceremony was small. Pete Callahan came, and Josiah Harrow, and Aldous Webb from the post office, and a handful of the families from the ranches nearby, who had always been on cordial if not close terms with the Vosses, and who came with the goodwill that attends a wedding when the couple in question has clearly chosen well. Clara had sent a letter from San Francisco that Elara read the morning of the wedding, and which made her sit at the kitchen table in her good dress for a full 5 minutes, in a state of quiet emotion before she stood up and went to the church. Mabel Greer came, which surprised Elara. The woman was dressed in her best hat and sat in the third pew and cried through the entire ceremony, which was either genuine sentiment or the performance of it. And by then, Elara had decided that Mabel Greer was more complicated than she had given her credit for, and that perhaps the old woman's comments about fierceness had come less from cruelty than from a genuine and mistaken belief that the world would not accommodate it. Elara wore her mother's silver pin at her collar, which was the only piece of jewelry she owned that was not purely functional, and Cole wore a clean white shirt and a dark coat that fit him as though it had been made for him, which it had not, but he wore things the way he did everything, with a straight and uncomplicated ease. When Reverend Dunes asked if she took this man, she said "I do" with the tone of someone who has made her mind up entirely and is satisfied with the result. When Reverend Dunes asked if Cole took this woman, Cole said "I do" in the direct and unhurried way he said everything, looking at Elara without the theatrical romance of a man performing for an audience, but with the steady, particular attention of a man who means what he says. They rode home together down the ranch road in the bright March afternoon with the desert beginning to think about spring, the air still cool and clear, with the smell of the creosote bushes that perfumed the territory every time moisture threatened or arrived. She was riding her roan mare, and he was riding the dark bay, and their horses moved together easily along the road they both knew well. "Well," Cole said, when they turned in at the ranch gate. "Well," she said. Sargent came out to meet them at a pace that indicated the celebratory nature of the occasion had not been communicated to him, but he was prepared to treat any return from absence as a triumph worth marking. They had a supper that evening that was considerably better than usual, because Elara had spent 2 days prior to the wedding preparing it, reasoning that the wedding meal ought to be something worth remembering. And they ate at the kitchen table with the lamp warm between them and talked about the spring work and the cattle numbers, and the plan to expand the north pasture fence. Which was the kind of conversation that most people would not describe as romantic, but which between them had exactly the warmth of two people who have chosen each other, and are finding that the choice improves everything they look at together. After supper he helped her wash the dishes, which he had never done before, and she let him without protest, and they stood at the kitchen basin with the evening dark outside the window and his shoulder warm against hers. And she thought that this was the particular happiness that nobody tells you about, the kind that does not look remarkable from the outside, but that you carry with you like something very solid in the center of your chest. Spring came to the ranch with its full conviction, and with it the work that spring demanded, and the work that spring demanded from a ranch that had a second pair of capable hands for the first time in many years was considerably more manageable than it had been. They drove the cattle to the new spring pasture together, mended the fence on the north section that the winter winds had worked at, and planted the kitchen garden in the middle of April, with the dry earth accepting the seeds with the resignation of something that knows what is coming and is making a reasonable peace with it. She wrote to Marcus in April to tell him she had married Cole Whitaker in March, and Marcus wrote back with an enthusiasm that was, knowing Marcus, entirely genuine, and said that he wished he could have been there and that he intended to visit in the fall if the distance could be managed, and that Clara sent her warmest congratulations. Thomas also wrote, which surprised her. Thomas had somehow, in California, come across a situation that he described as steady employment at a shipping company, and his letter, which was shorter than Marcus's but no less genuine, said that he was glad she had found someone worth the finding. She wrote back to both brothers, and the correspondence, which had been sparse and slightly guilty for 2 years, became a warmer and more regular thing. Cole's steadiness was not the steadiness of passivity. She had learned that quickly. He had opinions and he held them, and when he disagreed with her about how to handle something, which happened with a regularity that suited both of them because neither of them had any interest in being managed, he said so plainly. They argued about the best approach to the south pasture rotation in April, standing in the field with the sun coming down on them both, and the argument was direct and had heat in it, and was resolved by what turned out to be a combination of both their positions that worked better than either individual approach, which was annoying and satisfying in exactly equal measure. "You were right about the timing," she said, when they could see the evidence of it 6 weeks later. "You were right about the section division," he said. "We were both right," she said. "That seems like a reasonable outcome," he said. By summer she was carrying their child, which she discovered in the particular way of women of the time, through the accumulation of evidence that her body presented to her over several weeks until the evidence was undeniable. She told Cole on a July evening on the porch, directly and without preamble, because that was how she told things. He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that she looked at him, and what she saw on his face was not the complicated thing she had half expected, the calculation of cost or the flinching from responsibility, but something very simple and very whole, something that she could only describe as the expression of a man who finds that life has given him more than he had allowed himself to expect. "Are you all right?" he asked, and the question was about her, first and entirely, which was the right question. "I am very well," she said. "I am going to continue to be very well." I will need you to understand that I intend to keep working for the full length of this, and I am not interested in being treated as though I have become fragile." "I would not dare," he said. "Good," she said. He reached across the porch and took her hand and held it, and the evening came down around them blue and warm, and the stars appeared one by one over the red hills, and the desert said nothing because it did not need to. The pregnancy was straightforward, as she had predicted to herself it would be, because she had decided to approach it with the same practical competence she brought to everything in her body, which had been tended through years of hard work and fresh air and good water from Broken Creek, obliged her. She rode until November when she decided, on her own timetable, that the mare could do without her company for a few weeks, and she transferred her energy to the indoor work that winter brought with it, and she made a cradle from the cedar wood in the barn, because she was not the type to wait for someone else to make something she could make herself. Cole did not tell her to rest. He did tell her, once gently, that she did not need to carry the full wood bin by herself, which was a fair point, and she accepted it without particular drama. Their son was born in February of 1884, delivered by the midwife from the southern district who arrived with her bag and her capable hands and her complete lack of excitable dramatics, which suited Elara perfectly. The birth was hard in the way that births are hard, which is to say that it was entirely work, the most concentrated kind, and Elara approached it the way she approached every other kind of concentrated work, with her jaw set and her full attention on what needed to be done. Cole was not in the room, which was not the custom of the time, but he was just outside the door, and she was aware of his presence, there the way she was always aware of his presence, as a steady fact that had become part of the structure of her life. When it was done and she was holding her son, who had arrived in the world with the emphatic opinion of someone who had decided to weigh 9 pounds, and to announce this fact loudly, the midwife brought Cole in. He came to the side of the bed and looked at the child in Elara's arms, and his face did the thing she had seen in July, that same simple wholeness, and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and then at his wife with an expression that she thought she would be able to remember with precision for the rest of her life if she lived to be 100. "He has your jaw," Cole said. "That poor child," she said. Cole laughed, and it was a real laugh, the kind she did not hear from him very often, which was another thing about him that made the real laugh worth something. They named him Jacob after her father. It had not been a long conversation. Cole had asked if she had a preference, she had said the name, and he had said that was a good name, and that had been that. Cole Whitaker turned out to have the emphatic opinions that his entrance into the world had promised. He was loud when he was hungry and loud when he was not, and occasionally loud for reasons that appeared to be aesthetic, and he was strong and determined, and watched the world with bright dark eyes that took in everything with an intensity that made Pete Callahan, who visited in March, say that the boy looked like he was taking inventory. "He gets that from his mother," Cole said. "He gets most of it from his mother," Elara agreed, nursing the baby with the businesslike comfort of a woman who has decided that there is nothing impractical about this particular work. The ranch in the spring of 1884 was a different place than it had been 2 years before, not different in the red hills or the long roads or the creek that ran cold and clear and legally hers through the eastern pasture, but different in the life that moved through it. Cole had finished the hands' cabin properly, and it served now as a second building, used for storage and overflow and the occasional visiting hand they hired in the busy seasons. The garden was expanded. There were more cattle in better condition. There was a baby in the house. There was also, in a small but real way, a shift in the town's relationship to Elara, which she noticed and appreciated and did not make a large thing of. Part of it was the water rights case, which had established her legal competence in a manner that the town could not overlook. Part of it was Cole himself, whose quiet and evident decency reflected back on her in the way that the presence of a steady person confirms the judgment of those who chose them. And part of it was simply time, and the softening of unfamiliarity into knowledge, and the fact that when Elara rode into town with the baby on her hip, she smiled at people and said good morning, and was, when not being required to shoot anyone's hat off, a person who was genuinely warm when warmth was appropriate. Mabel Greer came out of the millinery one morning in April to admire the baby, and held him for a moment with the practiced ease of a woman who has held many babies, and said that he was a fine boy. Then she said, without quite meeting Elara's eyes, that she supposed she had been wrong about some things, back a couple of years. Elara looked at the old woman holding her son. She thought about the boardwalk and the calico and the too fierce for any man, and she thought about Cole's response to it, 4 words spoken to the desert stars, and she thought about all the things that had been built in the space between that evening and this one. "You are not entirely wrong," Elara said. "I am fierce. I have not changed that. I just found someone who matched it." Mabel Greer looked at her, and then at the baby, and then toward the hardware store where Cole had gone for hinges and nails, and was visible through the window talking to the proprietor with the easy attention he brought to every conversation, and the old woman nodded slowly, as though something had been resolved in her. "I suppose that is how it ought to go," she said, handing the baby back. "I suppose it is," Elara agreed. By the following year, 1885, Marcus had made good on his promise to visit, arriving in September with Clara and with a son of his own, an 8-month-old named Peter, and the ranch for 2 weeks had the particular pleasant chaos of a household with more people in it than it was built for, and everyone making the adjustments with good will. Clara and Elara took to each other as they had taken to each other's letters, with the mutual recognition of 2 capable women who did not need to perform their liking. Marcus and Cole took to each other with the cautious, and then increasingly genuine respect of 2 men who are both competent in practical ways, and find that they have things to talk about. And by the end of the 2 weeks, they were discussing cattle breeding and fence line, engineering at the supper table with the ease of people who have known each other longer. Thomas came the following spring, which no one had quite expected, arriving on a horse from the train station at Flagstaff with a pack, and the slightly abashed expression of a man who has been aware for some time that he owes his sister more than he has given her. Elara met him at the gate and hugged him, and did not say anything about the abashed expression, because the hug itself was the reply to it. Thomas was 28 now, steadier than he had been in the California letters, and he stayed for a month and worked alongside Cole with a willingness that Elara suspected was partly gratitude and partly genuine enjoyment. And when he left, he shook Cole's hand and told him that he was glad Elara had found him, and Cole said he was glad too, and both men seemed to mean it. Jacob grew the way children grow in the desert, fast and with a toughness that is not hardness but a specific flexibility, bending into the wind and coming back upright. He walked at 11 months and talked at 13, and what he said when he talked were complete sentences delivered with the directness of both his parents, which made the midwife laugh when she heard about it, and Pete Callahan say that the boy was going to either be a lawyer or a rancher, and possibly both. Cole taught him the names of the horses before he was 2. Elara taught him the names of the plants in the kitchen garden. By the time he was 3, he was following his father around the corral with the short-legged seriousness of a child, who has decided that whatever the adults are doing is the most important thing happening anywhere. And Cole bore this with the patient and genuine engagement of a man who finds the company of a small, determined person more interesting than not. There was a second child, a daughter born in 1887, who came into the world at midnight in October with the quiet focus of a person who has decided to arrive on her own schedule and not make a production of it. They named her Anna after Cole's mother, which had been his one suggestion about names and which Elara had accepted without hesitation. Anna Whitaker turned out to be the opposite of her brother in temperament, not in stubbornness, because she had full measure of that from both sides but in style. Where Jakob announced himself, Anna observed. She watched everything with her father's steady eyes and her mother's measuring calm, and when she had decided what she thought about a thing, she said it with a precision that made people twice her age look at her with surprised respect. The ranch by 1888 was a successful operation, not wealthy by the standards of the large cattle empires that were being built elsewhere in the territory, but solid and growing, the kind of success that comes from knowing the land you are working and working it with consistent intelligence. They had expanded the herd, improved the irrigation from the creek, and established a relationship with a buyer in Flagstaff that gave them a reliable market for their beef. Cornelius Pratt had left Reedrock Crossing sometime in the year after the court ruling, returned to Tucson with his solicitor and his large folder of documents, and if he had tried similar tactics elsewhere in the territory, he had done so in places that were not Elara Whitaker's concern. She thought of him occasionally and without particular feeling, the way you think of a difficult weather event that caused temporary damage and then passed. The water from Broken Creek ran cold and clear and legally hers through all the seasons, feeding the cattle and the kitchen garden, and the tank behind the barn and the life that had been built on and around it. In the mornings when the light came first over the eastern ridge and caught the water in the creek, it had a gold and amber quality that was particular to that hour, and that she never stopped noticing, because it was the kind of thing that deserved to be noticed every time. She was standing at the creek in October of 1888 in the early morning, when Cole came up behind her and stood beside her the way he always stood beside her, with a half-step of space that was not distance but the particular respectfulness of someone who understands that the person next to them is complete in themselves. She was 32 years old. He was 34. They had been married for nearly 6 years and working alongside each other for a year before that, and she thought, standing at the creek in the gold morning light, that she knew him better than she had known anything in her life, including the land, including the work, including herself, because knowing him had also been a form of knowing herself, of finding in his certainty about what she was a language for things she had always understood but not always had a name for. "The heifers are ready to move to the south section," he said. "I know," she said. "I was going to say the same thing. Should we do it this morning or after?" "This morning," she said. "Before the heat." He nodded. He looked at the creek the way she was looking at the creek, with the affection of something familiar and valued. They stood there for another minute in the gold light, the water going over the stones with the sound that it had always made and would continue to make, and the desert coming awake around them with the thousand small movements and sounds of its full and complicated life. "Cole," she said. "Yes." "I was thinking about the North Pasture expansion again," she said. "I think we have the resource now to do the full section rather than the half section." "I think so too," he said. "I ran the numbers last week. We are in a position to do it in the spring." "Good," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. In the morning light his face was the same face it had been when he rode up that first afternoon on the sun-faded horse, the same quality of direct attention and quiet humor, and something underneath that she had learned over years was not reserve, but the particular honesty of a person who says what he means and means what he says and has never tried to be more than that or less. "I love you," she said. She said it with the plainness she brought to everything, not as a performance or a ritual, but as a fact that she was choosing to state aloud because it was a true thing and true things deserved to be said. "I love you," he said, the same way. The direct way. From the direction of the house came the sound of Jakob and Anna embarking on whatever morning argument was first on the schedule, their voices carrying clear in the still air, and Sergeant barking in what might have been participation or mediation, and the pig, who was a different pig from the original but similarly uncertain in temperament, making an opinion known about something in its vicinity. Elara and Cole looked at each other. "We should get to work," she said. "We should," he agreed. They turned from the creek and walked back toward the house and the barn and the children and the day, side by side on the familiar ground, through the morning light that touched everything, through the life that was theirs, that had been built from fierceness and steadiness, and two people who had found in each other not a softening of what they were, but a matching of it, a recognition that was also a homecoming. The particular kind that happens not when you arrive somewhere, but when you realize that you have been there for a while and that you are, without question, exactly where you are supposed to be. The territory around them went on being the territory, hard and beautiful and indifferent and magnificent. The red hills standing against the sky as they had stood before any of them arrived and would stand long after. The creek running in its course, the desert breathing its slow, patient breath, and the Whitaker ranch sitting in the valley below the ridge with its adobe walls and its kitchen garden and its expanded fence lines, and its cattle moving in the golden morning toward the south section pasture. Tended by two people who were too fierce for easy things and had found in each other something that was neither easy nor hard, but simply, honestly, entirely right. Their children grew up knowing the land the way their parents knew it, from the inside out, with the kind of knowledge that lives in the hands and the feet and the eyes rather than on maps. Jacob became, in time, exactly what Pete Callahan had predicted, both rancher and something close to a lawyer, a man who could negotiate a cattle price in the morning and argue a land claim in the afternoon, and preferred both to a courtroom, but was effective in all three. Anna grew into a woman whose quiet watchfulness had become a kind of wisdom that people sought out, who married a schoolteacher from Flagstaff at 22 and spent her life between his school and her parents' ranch, in a way that satisfied both the inheritance she had been given and the future she had chosen. In the evenings of those later years, when the children were grown and the house was quieter, Elara and Cole sat on the porch, the way they had always sat on the porch, in the blue desert dark, drinking coffee from tin cups, watching the stars come out over the red hills that had been the horizon of their shared life for more than 2 decades. The conversation moved as it always had, practical and warm, between the things that needed doing and the things that had been done, and the occasional perfect silence that two people earn when they have been honest with each other long enough to trust the quiet. The creek ran below them in the dark, cold and clear, and theirs. It was enough. It was, in fact, exactly the kind of enough that takes a lifetime to understand the value of, the kind that you do not measure against grand events or external recognition, but against the particular weight of a day fully worked, and a person fully known, and a life fully chosen, with all the fierceness and all the steadiness and all the love that those things carry when they are placed without apology in the hands of someone who meets them with their own. The night came down fully over Red Rock Crossing and the desert and the ranch in the valley below the ridge, and the stars were very bright over Arizona territory, as they had always been and would continue to be, keeping watch over a land that asked everything of the people who loved it and gave everything back. Elara Whitaker set down her coffee cup and leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, and Cole Whitaker put his arm around her with the ease of a man who has had years to practice the particular rightness of this, and together they sat in the quiet of everything they had made, and it was good, and it was theirs, and it was home.